Do you know the story of the greatest railroad that never ran? The Hampden Railroad was to connect the village of Bondsville here in Palmer to the rail lines of Springfield back in the 1900s. Good evening, I'm Darcy Fortune, and here with me tonight is author Philip Johnson of the book, The Hampden Railroad, the Greatest Railroad That Never Ran. Thank you so much for being with me tonight.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell me, what happened to this railroad? Why is it the lost railroad of Western Mass?
The Hampden Railroad, as we know, is one of the 7 railroads of Palmer. It was built as a connector line to connect the railroads from Springfield to Palmer to the central Mass. It was to bring the passengers from the southwest, basically New York City, up to Maine, in the vacation lands in New Hampshire. The railroad was built in 1911, 12, and 13 and never was approved for operation, so it never opened and ran any passengers on it.
How long have you been following this track in history?
I've been researching this for almost 30 years. I was started on this project. Bob Buck told me about one of these railroad lines because I asked about those abutments up here on 181. You know, those big high abutments. What was on top of those? And Bob said, oh, that was the Hampden Railroad. It never ran. Why not? Well, nobody really knows. So I started to research it, and a good friend of mine found some construction photographs of the railroad, so I was able to purchase those, and that really helped me on my research.
And tell me a little bit about Bob Buck. How is he almost a key role in making this, writing this book?
Bob Buck is one of those local characters from Warren and West Warren who knows everything about all the railroads in the area, or did. He's gone to heaven ahead of us. He knew all these little tidbits of information, knew the one to ask for this and the one to ask for that. And he drew me a little sketch one day and said, here's all the railroads on this one little piece of paper. And it was a wonderful start of my research.
And how did he know so much about this? Was he working on the rail lines?
No, he grew up, as I said, in Warren, and to hear him tell it, from the earliest days he could peek out the window. He watched the trains go by downtown past the center of town there, and he just loved them to death, paid attention all his life.
I know you have a disc of pictures to show me, but where specifically in Palmer is these landmarks left behind?
Some of the landmarks, what you'd find today, are some of the concrete abutments where the railroad was raised up to maintain a grade, so it didn't go uphill too fast. So they raised the railroad up by putting all this earthworks in, and then they'd have to put abutments to hold up the steel for bridges across the roads. You'll see those mostly north of us here in Bondsville, in Three Rivers, and they connected to the Central Mass Railroad up by the old Palmer Airport. So
this railroad was to run through Palmer, but where else did it connect to?
We'll say Palmer's the east end of the railroad. It kind of runs southwest. If you drive on the Mass Turnpike, you drive on a piece of it. It went down to Springfield by exit 6 of the Turnpike and then down to Athol Junction. Those are people that are not familiar with that landmark in Springfield. That's right near the Typeflex manufacturing plant, right next to Route 291. How
did this affect business and families in the surrounding community? Talk about the money loss.
Well, the Hampden Railroad, it takes money to make money, so there had to be investors for this. There were a couple of people with some big bucks behind it that put up some of the money, but then, of course, there's also stocks issued, just like today when you have a large project. You issue stocks to raise capital to do the construction. These investors, put in all their money. Originally, the railroad was chartered by the state to spend $2.2 million to build this project. With construction overruns and other things, this ended up costing $4 million to build. So the state would not approve we'll call it a license to operate because of those cost overruns, and they just couldn't recover from that.
And talk about you know, the thousands of men that worked on this rail line that never even ended up running?
Well, back in the early 19-teens, there were not a lot of heavy construction equipment like we know today, the big bulldozers and cranes and this sort of thing. So a lot of this work was done by hand. Men with picks and shovels and axes and wheelbarrows and all this sort of thing. The only big equipment was the big cranes that moved big rocks when they cut through the rock in some of the mountains they cut through. So there were 1,000 men at any one time working all over this railroad, and they would work for $1.10 a day, which doesn't sound like much now, but then it was pretty good money, and they would work 6 days, 10-hour days for that.
With it not coming to Palmer, how do you think that affected the community and the businesses in the community?
Well, as it progressed through the area, they were always trying to get more business for the railroad. As I said, it was just like a bridge route to bring passengers through, but there was local interest for industries to hook up to it. There was a tire company in Ludlow that was going to be built next to it. There's a lot of support to build the railroad, and to hope that it operates would get more traffic on the other lines. It really didn't have a major effect, not a lot of fallout other than the jobs when the railroad was completed.
Right. Phil, your story shows that money and politics were a big factor in the railroad not being successful. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's more money than politics, but as I said, there were many people involved behind the scenes. There was a local construction company out of Westfield that actually built the railroad. They were, Mr. Gillett was coached by Charles Mellon from the New Haven Railroad, who was also president of the B&M Railroad. So he had most of New England railroads under his domain, if you will. So he coached Mr. Gillett on how to build and how to market his railroad. And Mr. Mellon was also coached by the big New York bankers. So he had a lot of money behind him. And coached Mr. Gillett through setting up the Hampden Investment Company to handle the stock sales and reinvesting the money in the railroad company.
So would you say there was almost like a scandal involved?
The more you think about it and the more you read, it really seems like a scam to take money from all these investors and not really produce a big product. You know, the fact that it didn't operate was just icing on the cake. You know, they took everybody's money. Like, as I said, they spent $4 million building it. When all was said and done, it was sold for auction in 1929 for just under $40,000.
Wow.
Huge loss.
Wow. Now, what makes you so interested in this?
When Mr. Buck told me about this years and years ago, start looking for other sources of information about this railroad. And all I could find was a couple of small newspaper articles and the miscellaneous little 3 or 4 page article written in the railroad journals, you know, in the 30s and 40s. And there's really nothing written about it. So, well, how do you find out about this? So I dug into the Springfield newspaper archives. My wife and I spent many days going through the microfilms, printing off every page of everything we could find on the Hampden, and then rereading that over and over until I finally understood what was going on. The Massachusetts Railroad Commission published an annual report, but that was just gains and losses on their stocks and how many miles of track they had. Not a lot of information there. What got me really hooked was that nobody knew much about it. And, well, somebody should tell this story. So I, you know, as I said, just kept researching and researching, finding more and more small little articles, piecing it all together to try to put it all in one place. Because every other railroad of Palmer had something written about it that was comprehensive, except this one.
This isn't the first book on railroads that you've been involved in. You were involved with another project through the Palmer Public Library?
Yes, the Palmer Public Library Railroad Advisory Board, I believe they called themselves. They published a book just a few years ago called One Town, Seven Railroads. And I was asked if I had anything to share for that on the Hampden Railroad. So I opened up my archives of all of those construction pictures and everything I'd collected over the years, and many of my photos are in the Hampden Railroad section in that book. Never published anywhere except there and my book.
And are you working on any other books, any other projects you're taking in?
Right now I'm taking a breather. This was a major project for me. I'm not really a writer. I'm an engineer, a plastics engineer, so this is not really my thing, but I got through it. My wife helped me a lot with the editing and formatting of the pages and this sort of thing. So I think we're taking a break for a little bit. Don't know if there'll be a volume 2 or not. I tried to tell the whole story in here. If there's anything more coming, it would just be maps and more photos.
Great. Well, we appreciate you keeping the history of the railroads alive, and thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
You can pick up Philip's book at Tucker's Hobbies, The Hampden Railroad, the Greatest Railroad That Never Ran.